Acer's Triton Neo 16 is a remarkably premium laptop with frankly disappointing levels of performance. This £1,900 machine, which appears to be discounted by a whopping £500 on Acer's store at the time of filming, sports an interesting spec sheet, super premium build quality with an all-metal shell, stylish looks with a clean, subtle design, and a nice ostentatious RGB keyboard, and yet, as tested, the performance leaves me feeling underwhelmed. Let me show you what I mean. This version of the Triton Neo 16 I have here, I guess is what you would call a mid-range model. It sports an Intel Core Ultra 7 155H, great name I know, which is technically a 16-core part, but not really. This is a Meteor Lake chip, video in the cards above to find or explain why that's interesting, which means that it has 2 low-power Island E-cores, 8 standard sort of E-cores, and 6 P-cores, with the 6 P-cores doing the majority of the heavy lifting for performance-related or oriented tasks. That's paired with 16GB of soldered LPDDR5X RAM, an RTX 4060 laptop GPU with 8GB of VRAM, and in my case, 2TB of SSD space, which if we take a peek inside, you'll find that that's actually 2 1TB SK Hynix drives in RAID 0. A bit of a dangerous game both Asus and now Acer are playing with your data. Oh, and that 4060 laptop GPU is limited to just 110 watts of peak power consumption, down from 140 watts in other models. That Core Ultra 7 chip, the 155H Hexadeca core, does offer some impressive compute performance. Cinebench R23 has it doing pretty well in the multi-threaded sort of workload at around 18,000 points, which puts it up against the 13 and 12900H chips, both of which are near top-end parts compared to this 7 class part. The single-threaded performance is surprisingly weak though. It's still decent, hell it matches or beats any of the 7th gen Ryzen parts that I've tested, but compared to the 2000 plus points that the higher end last gen Intel parts can offer, well, it's a little concerning. I wonder if that will affect the gaming performance. This, kids, is called foreshadowing. Now, Blender has the 155H in basically the same spot, although the Ryzen parts tend to do a little better in the longer workloads, as they're almost always more efficient, and so can sustain their boost power levels for longer, hence why that 7940HS basically matches the 155H here in the Gooseberry render. The interesting part though is definitely the power consumption, because even looking at the stable load power rather than the peak power that they max out at, the 155H sucks back 63 watts, whereas the 7940HS only needed 47 watts to provide essentially the same performance, and with technically at least half the cores. Hell, the peak that Ryzen chip hit was 60 watts, 3 watts lower than the average from the Core Ultra 7, which managed to hit 93 watts at peak, proving despite the 2 different sets of efficiency cores, these are still power-hungry monsters. As for gaming performance, at least at the native resolution, which is 2560 by 1600, you can expect anywhere from decent 220 FPS average in Rainbow Six Siege and 186 FPS average in CS2, to a more mediocre 86 FPS in Hitman, 84 FPS in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and 77 FPS in Cyberpunk, and 70 FPS in Starfield, to a frankly abysmal 60 FPS in Flight Simulator and 55 FPS in Fortnite. This isn't exactly stellar performance, and if I'm honest, well, I think it's definitely let down by the lower TDP of that GPU. If it had more power on tap, it might be able to push a bit harder and actually make use of that 240Hz refresh rate that this thing offers. It doesn't even hit that in Siege or CS2, which is kinda disappointing. When testing a 1080p for the sake of a fair comparison, in CS2 you find the Triton Neo 16 towards the bottom of the chart, only just beating the higher powered Nitro 5, which sports an RTX 4050 laptop GPU, and quite the delta to the next highest result, a much more power-hungry XMG Core 16. In Cyberpunk, you do see a distinction between the 4050 and 4060 that's in this, but hell, even the lower power 4060 in the Nitro V15 I reviewed recently beats the Triton. That might be down to the hybrid chip design, especially with the 3 different types of cores now. But anyway, in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, it's kind of the same story, albeit this time the Triton does edge out the V15, but only slightly. For context, Acer's Helios Neo 16, which also uses an RTX 4060 laptop GPU, offered 159 FPS average here, compared to just 128 FPS on the Triton. Fortnite has the Triton at the back of the pack. Admittedly, it is pretty close to the V15 and even the Focus 16, but still. Microsoft Flight Simulator is the same story. At the back of the pack, behind even the 4050 Nitro 5 here, and light years behind the Helios Neo 16. Hitman 3's built-in benchmark lets me split out the CPU and GPU performance data, data rather, and this is the GPU data, where frankly I am shocked to see this RTX 4060 laptop chip be so far behind. It's literally 10 FPS behind the 4050, admittedly a much higher powered 4050 mind you, but that's not great. Siege has the Neo again towards the back, at least this time reasonably higher than the V15 and Nitro 5, and close to the Core 16. Lastly, in Starfield, again it's towards the back of the pack with 73 FPS average, about 10 FPS behind the next best result, which is from another RTX 4060 laptop GPU machine, the XMG Pro 16 Studio. Now, frankly, this all seems pretty disappointing. But it turns out that there is both a reason and a potential, if kind of flawed, solution. See, I test these machines on what I think is the most realistic power mode. Normally that's the performance, or in this case, gaming mode. Although I do also normally test in the higher modes to see if it actually makes a significant difference, and I'll include that data if it does. In this case, gaming mode is really more like a sort of quiet mode, although it's still not exactly quiet. Here's a look at the GPU power consumption through the Cyberpunk 2077 built-in benchmark run. Orange is the gaming run and blue is turbo. And yeah, you can see a pretty obvious difference here. The gaming mode limits performance pretty hard, meaning the 4060 is only drawing around 50 watts here compared to a stable 70 watts in turbo. That still isn't quite the 110 watts that this can draw, although in other games turbo does actually hit up to 110 watts, so I wouldn't be too worried. The catch is that the turbo mode is incredibly loud, and the fans have a pretty annoying high-pitched whine to them. It's frankly off-putting when you're trying to game with turbo mode enabled. Now with that said, here's a look at the gaming results again, but with turbo mode included. CS2 only sees a marginal improvement, likely because it's very much CPU limited, and it turns out that in my testing, turbo mode doesn't do much to the CPU. In fact, it actually made it a touch slower, including single-threaded benchmarks and tests. Cyberpunk sees a considerable uplift though, to much more sort of middle of the pack and a much more reasonable level of performance at 114 FPS average. Shadow of the Tomb Raider 2 sees a pretty significant uplift to much closer to the midfield. It isn't quite a match for the higher TDP versions of the 4060 that I've tested, but also that isn't exactly surprising. Fortnite sees an exceptional rise, where it now basically matches the Helios Neo 16. Admittedly, the Helios Neo 16 was running in its sort of performance or gaming mode rather than turbo, so there's likely more performance on tap if you can handle the noise on that one too. In Flight Simulator, there isn't much of an improvement. I mean, 10 FPS is nothing to shrug at, but it isn't quite midfield even with 10 FPS more. Hitman equally sees a pretty minimal improvement in the standings, although again, 15 FPS extra is fantastic just in its own right. Siege sees a more impressive rise to 324 FPS average, up from just 280 in the gaming mode, and Starfield sees the best performance I've tested at 92 FPS average when using turbo mode, so that's great news. As for the display, well, that's actually really pretty nice. As the big stickers say, this is a 1600p, 240Hz, 3 millisecond claimed response time panel that is Kalman certified. What that means is that it should look stunning, and honestly, it kinda does. It's bright, vibrant, the colours really pop and look vivid and sharp. I really like looking at this thing. Colours-wise, the Spider X reckons this covers 99% of the DCI-P3 spectrum, or 73% of Rec 2020. You're also looking at a bit over 500 nits of peak brightness, although something that I definitely noticed was the lacking contrast. The Spider X2 reported a contrast ratio of just 780 to 1 at full brightness, or maximally 970 to 1 at 0% brightness, which isn't great. It means that anything black looks grey, and especially the darker shades all kind of blend together rather than nicely stand out. Still, accuracy is good with an average delta E of just 1.3, with no results peaking over the target of 2, which is excellent. Honestly, to the eye, this is a very pretty panel. The contrast is a shame, but you can definitely still enjoy content on this for sure, and of course games look great too. Happily, Acer does include an overdrive setting in their Predator Sense software, along with a bunch of other customization settings, including the performance modes we talked about, fan modes, keyboard lighting controls, and a few other bits and pieces. It's a good thing they do, because without it, the average response time is 8 milliseconds, basically twice the refresh rate, and that's really not good. Now happily, if you do enable the overdrive mode, you bring that average down to just 4.76 milliseconds, which is much closer to the refresh rate window. Taking a look at the high-speed footage, you can see that while it isn't quite fast enough to match the 240Hz refresh rate, as the frame moves on before it really finishes drawing and there's at least 2 copies of the frame on screen at any one time, it's a lot better than without. In fact, here is what that looks like for reference. The ghosting is definitely more prevalent and makes for a more blurry and just smeary gaming experience. If you have one of these machines, I would definitely recommend turning overdrive on. As for input lag, that's pretty much spot on at around 3 milliseconds, which is really what I expect to see here. That means that the gaming experience, at least on the higher sort of performing titles like Siege, is actually pretty good. It isn't exactly your next pro gaming machine, but it's more than good enough to have an enjoyable time on it. On turbo mode, the fan noise is definitely distracting if you aren't wearing headphones, but if you are, well, then you get a much better experience. You still can't make good use of the 240Hz refresh rate in most games, but it's still a pretty good time. I'd also note that the keyboard is pretty nice for gaming. It's reasonably tactile and pretty fast actuating. It's also pretty nice to type on too. The trackpad is massive. It's actually really nice to use, has all of the gestures you want, and frankly makes the whole machine a really nice experience. I/O-wise, it's kind of a little strange. On the left, you've got 2 USB-C ports, one of which is Thunderbolt, a combo audio jack, and DC in, and on the right you have HDMI, 2 USB-A ports, and a microSD card reader. Having your only USB-A ports on the right-hand side is a bit annoying because that's kind of where your mouse goes, and yeah, especially only having 2, I guess they've swapped it in favour of an extra USB-C port and therefore a USB-C hub, but that's still a bit of a shame. I suppose Acer is going for the more premium, sort of thin and kind of light category here, so I suppose that makes sense. A peek inside shows you the cooling solution. It's mighty thin, which likely contributes to both the noise, the lower TDPs, and the fairly high heat too. It does do a good job of keeping the heat away from the top side and the keyboard though, so at least that's something. As mentioned at the start, you do have two M.2 slots, although in this configuration they're populated with two 1TB SK Hynix drives in RAID 0, so at least in this config it isn't exactly upgradable without a full backup first. RAM is unfortunately soldered, so even if you wanted 32 gigs of RAM, well, you can't have it, at least on this model. Oh, and the battery is a decent but not massive 76 watt-hour unit, which if you're just web browsing at a moderate brightness, should last a decent amount of time, although of course for gaming you're really talking in minutes, not hours. Overall, the Triton Neo 16 is a bit of a weird one. For £1,900, I don't think that I can justify the performance you get out of this. Sure, on turbo mode it's okay, but it's noisy as hell, and the performance still only just about matches a generation old Helios Neo 16, so unless you really care about this being a touch slimmer and admittedly more premium thanks to that nice metal shell, the Helios or something similar might be a better choice. For £500 off though, well, that's more interesting. That still makes it £1,400, which is a lot of money, but it becomes a much better value for money. At that price, I think the performance is much more fitting, and the benefits of 2 TB of storage and a very nice build quality actually become relevant. Of course, those are my thoughts, but I'd love to hear yours in the comments down below. What do you think of the Triton Neo 16? Is this a machine for you? Would you prefer something a touch thicker but considerably more performant like the Helios Neo 16, or something else entirely? Let me know in the comments down below. I will leave a link to this in the description if you are interested, and if you want to see more videos like this one, you can hit the subscribe button, turn on the bell notification icon, check out plenty of other videos on the end cards, and if you want to be able to test laptops and displays and stuff like this yourself, you can buy my open source response time tool at osrtt.com, and that's linked in the description. I make them right here at home and ship them worldwide. Otherwise, that's kind of it. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you all in the next video.